Ethan had always harbored a deep appreciation for the charm and resilience of classic vehicles. To him, they weren't just machines. They were pieces of history, stories forged in steel and chrome, symbols of an era when craftsmanship trumped convenience. That passion had found its ultimate expression in a 1972 Dodge D100 he'd stumbled upon in a dusty barn a few years back. The truck was a shadow of its former glory, its once vivid paint dulled by rust, its engine a lifeless hulk. But where others saw decay, Ethan saw potential. Restoring the truck became Ethan's obsession. Every weekend and spare evening he poured his energy, time and money into the project. He scoured scrapyards for rare parts, scrolled through online forums for advice, and spent countless hours under the hood, his hands caked in grease. Each milestone, reviving the engine, replacing the suspension or applying the final coat of its deep blue paint, felt like a small triumph. It was more than just a project. It was a labor of love, a tribute to perseverance and a reminder of his late father who had passed down the love of cars. The restoration was far from easy. There were moments of frustration, days when bolts wouldn't budge, parts didn't fit or progress felt painfully slow. But through it all, Ethan's vision remained steadfast. He could picture the truck in its full glory, a gleaming workhorse, sturdy and reliable, with a low growl that turned heads as it cruised through the streets. That dream fueled him, and when the restoration was finally complete, the truck surpassed even his highest expectations. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a masterpiece. Ethan's neighbors often stopped to admire the truck. Kids pointed at it in awe, and older residents shared stories of similar models they'd owned decades ago. For Ethan, parking the truck in his driveway felt like a badge of honor, a testament to years of hard work. But not everyone appreciated it. Marcy lived 2 houses down, a figure as polarizing as she was influential. As the president of the neighborhood's HOA, she was known for her unyielding enforcement of the community rules, no matter how trivial. Most residents viewed her as an overbearing busybody, though few dared to confront her. To Marcy, rules weren't just guidelines. They were tools to shape the neighborhood into her version of perfection. Ethan had managed to avoid her radar for years, but that was about to change. The first time Ethan noticed Marcy lingering near his driveway, he didn't think much of it. She seemed to be inspecting the truck, her sharp eyes narrowing as she circled it. He greeted her casually, proud of his work, but her response, a tight smile and a curt "nice, interesting choice," left him uneasy. That unease would soon transform into something far more troubling. Ethan had no way of knowing that the truck he had poured his heart into was about to become the target of Marcy's next crusade. Ethan's truck quickly became the centerpiece of his driveway, a symbol of his hard work and passion. But not everyone saw it that way. Marcy, the neighborhood's self-proclaimed enforcer, seemed to develop a peculiar fixation on it. At first, her disapproval was subtle. A prolonged glance, a muttered comment about keeping the neighborhood standards high. Ethan brushed it off, chalking it up to Marcy's infamous need to micromanage every detail of the community. After all, this was his property and the truck was his pride and joy. Things escalated one sunny Saturday afternoon when Ethan was outside polishing the truck's chrome bumper. Marcy approached him, clipboard in hand, her expression a mix of feigned concern and thinly veiled judgment. "You know," she began, her tone overly sweet, "we have rules about the types of vehicles that can be kept in this neighborhood." Ethan paused, rag in hand, confused. "Rules? About trucks?" he asked, glancing at her clipboard. "Yes," she replied, tapping the board as though it held irrefutable evidence. "Older vehicles, especially ones that aren't environmentally friendly, can't be parked here. It's in the bylaws." Ethan frowned. He had read the HOA rules when he first moved in years ago and had never seen anything remotely like that. "I don't think that's true," he said, trying to keep his tone civil. "This truck is parked in my driveway on my property. I'm pretty sure that's allowed." Marcy's smile tightened. "You'd be surprised what's in the fine print. I'd suggest looking over the rules again. I'd hate to have to escalate this." Ethan was left speechless. Escalate? Over his truck? The interaction left a sour taste in his mouth, but he decided to follow her advice. That evening he pulled out the HOA bylaws and combed through them line by line. As he suspected, there was no mention of vehicle restrictions beyond parking in designated areas and ensuring driveways were clear of debris. There was certainly nothing banning older trucks or vehicles with gasoline engines. Relieved but still irritated, Ethan decided to let the issue slide, hoping Marcy would too. But as the days went by, her disapproval became more overt. She began leaving notices on his mailbox, each citing vague violations about community harmony and aesthetic disruptions. Neighbors started whispering about Marcy's sudden obsession with Ethan's truck, though few dared to challenge her directly. One evening, Ethan returned from work to find Marcy standing in front of his driveway, arms crossed and lips pursed. "Ethan," she called out as he stepped out of his car. "We've given you enough warnings. If you don't remove that truck, the HOA will be forced to take action." "Take action? You can't just make up rules," Ethan shot back, his frustration finally boiling over. "I checked the bylaws. There's nothing about my truck." Marcy smirked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to maintain order. If you won't follow the guidelines, I'll ensure they're enforced." Ethan's stomach twisted in anger and disbelief. He couldn't fathom why she was so determined to target him. This wasn't about rules, it felt personal. But he wasn't one to back down. Ethan knew he needed to stand his ground, not just for himself but for the principle of it. What he didn't realize was that Marcy was already preparing her next move, one that would push the situation far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. Ethan thought the tension with Marcy had reached its peak, but he couldn't have been more wrong. A few days later, after a long day at work, he turned the corner onto his street, eager to relax and maybe take the truck out for a spin. But as he pulled into his driveway, his heart sank. The truck wasn't there. At first he panicked, thinking it had been stolen. He checked the driveway, the street, and even the garage just in case he had forgotten where he'd parked it. But it was nowhere to be found. Then he noticed something taped to his mailbox, a bright orange towing slip. His stomach dropped as he read the words. "Vehicle towed at the request of the HOA for violation of neighborhood regulations." Furious, Ethan dialed the number on the slip and a man with a bored tone answered. "Benny's Towing, how can I help you?" "You have my truck," Ethan said, barely able to keep his voice steady. "It's a blue 1972 Dodge D100. I need it back." "Let me check." "Yep, we've got it. Towed per HOA request for non-compliance. You'll need to pay the fees and get approval from the HOA to release it." Ethan clenched his fists. "What non-compliance? There's no rule against my truck. You can't just take it." "Sorry sir, you'll have to sort that out with the HOA. We're just following orders." Ethan hung up, his blood boiling. This was Marcy's doing, no doubt about it. She had crossed a line and he wasn't going to let it go. Early the next morning he marched to Marcy's house, demanding answers. She opened the door with a smug look, clearly expecting him. "I told you the truck wasn't allowed," she said matter-of-factly. "You refused to comply, so I took the necessary steps." "Necessary steps?" Ethan snapped. "You had no right to tow my truck. There's no rule against it and you know it." Marcy shrugged, her expression unbothered. "I'm the HOA president. I have the authority to enforce standards. If you have an issue, take it up with the board." Ethan couldn't believe her audacity. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. "You're going to regret this." His first call was to a lawyer who confirmed what he already suspected. Marcy's actions were completely illegal. The HOA had no documented rule banning the truck, and even if they did, proper notice and procedures were required before towing a vehicle. Ethan's lawyer wasted no time drafting a formal demand letter, giving the HOA 48 hours to return the truck and cancel any associated fines. But Marcy wasn't one to admit defeat. The HOA responded with a defiant letter claiming they work within their rights and refusing to return the truck without payment. It was clear Marcy was digging in her heels, forcing Ethan's hand. Word of the dispute began to spread through the neighborhood. To Ethan's surprise, several neighbors approached him with their own stories of Marcy's overreach. Fines for minor infractions, arbitrary rules, and threats of enforcement. It became clear this wasn't just about his truck. It was about standing up to Marcy's tyranny. With his neighbors rallying behind him, Ethan decided to escalate the fight. He filed a lawsuit against the HOA and Marcy personally, seeking not only the return of his truck but also compensation for the towing fees and damages. It was a bold move, but Ethan was determined to see it through. Little did he know the battle ahead would reveal even more about Marcy's abuse of power, and bring the entire neighborhood into the fray. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation on the day of the hearing. Neighbors had packed the gallery, eager to witness the showdown between Ethan and Marcy. To many, this was more than a legal dispute. It was a chance to challenge the oppressive grip Marcy had held over the community for years. Ethan walked in with his lawyer, nerves running high but bolstered by the support of the crowd and the rock-solid case they had prepared. Marcy, by contrast, appeared as confident as ever, sitting with the HOA's attorney and flipping through papers as if she'd already won. But Ethan could see the cracks in her facade, a slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped restlessly on the table. She was nervous even if she wouldn't admit it. The proceedings began with the HOA's lawyer presenting their case. His argument rested on vague claims that the HOA president had discretionary authority to enforce community standards. He insisted that older vehicles like Ethan's truck were disruptive to the neighborhood's appearance and that Marcy's actions were justified under her role. But when pressed by the judge to cite specific rules or bylaws that supported these claims, the lawyer faltered, unable to produce any concrete evidence. Next, Ethan's lawyer took the floor, delivering a sharp and compelling argument. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about a truck. It's about abuse of power. The HOA bylaws make no mention of vehicle restrictions, let alone a ban on older trucks. The defendant, acting outside her authority, ordered the towing of my client's vehicle without cause or due process. This action not only violated the HOA's own rules but also infringed upon my client's property rights." He presented copies of the HOA bylaws, highlighting the lack of any language prohibiting vehicles like Ethan's. He also introduced the towing slip and correspondence between Marcy and the towing company, demonstrating her direct involvement in the decision. It was clear, methodical, and damning. The judge turned to Marcy, giving her the chance to defend her actions. She stood, her confidence visibly shaken, and attempted to argue that the truck was a nuisance and posed a safety hazard. "There's an unspoken understanding among the board that older vehicles like that detract from the neighborhood's value," she claimed. "I acted in the best interests of the community." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Unspoken understandings do not constitute enforceable rules, Miss Marcy. Can you provide any documentation or board approval for your actions?" Marcy hesitated, her gaze darting around the courtroom. "Well, no, but..." The judge interrupted, his tone firm. "That's not how governance works. If there are no documented rules, you have no authority to enforce them. Personal opinions or informal agreements cannot override established bylaws." As the proceedings continued, Ethan's lawyer revealed even more damning evidence. Several neighbors had come forward with their own stories of unfair fines and fabricated violations under Marcy's leadership. Their testimonies painted a picture of a president who had consistently abused her position to impose arbitrary rules and intimidate residents into compliance. By the end of the day, it was clear the case was heavily in Ethan's favor. The judge delivered his verdict decisively. The towing of Ethan's truck was unauthorized, the fines were voided, and the HOA was ordered to cover all legal fees. Additionally, Marcy was held personally liable for damages, including the cost of retrieving the truck. As the judge's gavel fell, a ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Marcy sat frozen, her face pale as the reality of her defeat sank in. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been served, not just for him but for the entire neighborhood that had suffered under Marcy's rule. But the aftermath of the trial would prove to be just as significant, as the neighborhood began to unravel the full extent of Marcy's misconduct. In the weeks following the court's decision, the neighborhood began to reckon with the fallout from Marcy's actions. The once feared HOA president was now a disgraced figure, her authority shattered by the judge's ruling and the revelations that came to light during the trial. For Ethan, the relief of having his truck returned was just the beginning. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing his stand had sparked a broader movement for accountability. The first visible change came when the HOA board announced an emergency meeting to address Marcy's misconduct. Residents packed the community center, eager to voice their frustrations. Many shared stories of arbitrary fines, fabricated violations, and intimidating notices they had received under Marcy's leadership. The sheer volume of complaints made it clear that her actions hadn't been isolated incidents but part of a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. The board, faced with mounting pressure, voted unanimously to remove Marcy from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with applause from the gathered crowd, who cheered as Marcy, visibly humiliated, stormed out of the meeting without a word. But her resignation was only the beginning of her downfall. An independent audit of the HOA's records uncovered a litany of unauthorized actions taken by Marcy during her tenure. She had imposed illegal fines, diverted funds for personal projects, and manipulated HOA policies to target specific residents. The board had no choice but to ban her permanently from holding any position of authority within the HOA. Additionally, Marcy was ordered to reimburse the community for the financial damages caused by her misconduct. For Ethan, the return of his truck was a bittersweet victory. When Benny's towing finally brought the vehicle back, he inspected it carefully, relieved to find it in the same pristine condition as when it had been taken. Driving it through the neighborhood felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. But the experience had left its mark, teaching him the importance of standing up against those who abuse their power. The neighborhood, too, underwent a transformation. With Marcy gone, the HOA implemented reforms to ensure greater transparency and accountability. New rules were put in place to prevent future abuses, and the board encouraged residents to participate more actively in decision-making. A sense of community began to replace the fear and resentment that had festered under Marcy's rule. Ethan became something of a local hero, not just for his legal victory but for inspiring others to stand up for their rights. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now felt empowered to push back against unfair treatment. The ripple effect of his actions was clear. Marcy's reign had ended and the neighborhood had come out stronger because of it. As life returned to normal, Ethan reflected on the journey he had endured. The battle had been exhausting, but it had also been worth it. His truck, a symbol of hard work and resilience, now represented something even greater: the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. And every time he climbed into the driver's seat and heard the familiar rumble of the engine, he was reminded of the victory that had not only restored his vehicle but also restored balance to his community. What would you have done if someone like Marcy had targeted you? Would you have fought back or tried to resolve it differently? Have you ever encountered someone abusing their position of power? How did you handle it and what was the outcome? Thanks for sticking around to the end of this story. What do you think? Was justice served, or do you have a different take? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this tale of standing up to injustice, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you're the first to know when a new story drops. See you in the next one.